We continue now with our reading for the Torah. We'll be reading from, if you'd like to get ahead and find the place in the Torah, from Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. But first, a story. Once there was a great and powerful king who had as a most precious possession a set of delicate glass cups. And for a special occasion, the king wished to use these cups so that he might admire them and make use of their beauty. But the king worried. If I were to pour hot water into these beautiful vessels, surely they would expand and burst. And if I were to pour cold water into them, just as surely they would contract and shatter. So what did the king do? The hot water was mixed with the cold and then poured into cups so that the king could enjoy their use, and they did not break. So it was with the Holy One of Blessing. When the time had come to create the world, God reflected, and then God said, "If I create the world with the attribute of compassion alone, no one would be concerned with the consequences of their actions. But were I to create the world with the attribute of judgment alone, how could the world stand? Rather, behold, I created it with both the attribute of justice and the attribute of compassion, and hopefully it will stand for generations to come." This legend is a lesson on the 13 attributes of God. The words we speak before the reading of the Torah on this first day of Passover, famously on Yom Kippur, and on all the festivals and holy days throughout the year. They're drawn from the Torah, from the book of Exodus, chapter 34, verse 6. Please join me in the blessing for the reading of the Torah, and we'll share them together. That's on page 234 or 448. Baruch hu et Adonai hamvorach.
Baruch Adonai hamvorach leolam vaed.
Baruch Adonai hamvorach leolam vaed. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu et Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten haTorah.
Amen.
Vayashkem Moshe baboker. And Moses rose early in the morning. Vaya'al el har Sinai, ka'asher tziva Adonai oto. And he went up to Mount Sinai, just as God had commanded him. Vayikach b'yado shnei luchot avanim. And he took with him 2 tablets of stone. Vayared Adonai ba'anan. And God descended in a cloud. Vayityatzed imo sham. And stood there with him. Vayikra b'shem Adonai, and called in the name of God. Vayavor Adonai al panav, and God passed by Moses' face. Vayikra, and God said, Adonai, Adonai el rachum v'chanun, erech apayim v'rav chesed v'emet, notzer chesed lalafim, nose avon v'fesha v'chata'a v'nakeh. Adonai, Adonai, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in kindness and faithfulness, extending kindness to the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity, transgression, and sin, and granting pardon. These words are more than mere quotations from the Torah, and their presence in our Passover morning and holy day services is more than a simple prayer. For the Talmud tells us that these words themselves have the power to bring forgiveness for our faults and healing for our souls. As it is written, "Behold, I am making a covenant," God says. "Whenever Israel sins, let them recite these words, and I will forgive them." Well, at least that's what some people say the Talmud says. And herein lies the reason why the legend of the king and the glass cups was first told. For you see, while everyone agrees that these words, called the 13 attributes of God, hold great power, there's a difference of opinion upon their purpose and their use. These words of comfort were spoken first by God to Moses on the top of Mount Sinai, as a promise of forgiveness after the people of Israel had sinned by worshiping the golden calf. Having broken God's 10 commandments, Moses ascends again to the top of Mount Sinai, writes God's commandments again, this time with his own hands, and then receives the promise of the 13 attributes as God passes by Moses in the cleft of the rock. This moment in the Torah literally shines with God's presence. And these words of God's constant forgiveness echo through the rest of the Bible as an eternal promise of God's loving kindness, even when we stray from God's path. And yet, presented as simply as it seems in the Talmud, whenever Israel sins, and then let them recite these words, and I will forgive them, it sounds like the ultimate get-out-of-jail-free card, holding none of us accountable for our actions or our faults. Even in the Talmud, immediately after these words of the certainty of God's forgiveness, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Yehuda felt the need to say that there's no magical power to reciting the 13 attributes of God. For if you read these words of the Talmud more carefully, they do not say, let them say this list of attributes before me, but rather, let them do this list of attributes before me. Forgiveness is effected not by saying, but by the doing. Only when a person makes his or her attributes similar to those of God will the person's transgressions be forgiven. The 13 attributes are not a prescription for forgiveness of sin, but a program for human behavior. These 13 attributes, compassion, graciousness, forbearance, kindness, loyalty, and forgiveness, they're not merely a description of God's abounding loving kindness, but a prescription for our own actions towards one another. God gives laws and expects us to obey them. When we fail to do so, God's judgment is tempered by God's compassion in our lives. And so, like the king with the delicate glass cups, our world was created with a balance of both din, the attribute of justice, and chesed, the attribute of compassion, in order to achieve a livable world. We need to be held accountable for our actions, and at the same time, we need a measure of compassion for one another, or else the world will be too harsh for us to live in together in peace. Too harsh for us to live together in peace. Balance is a difficult thing to achieve, particularly in an age which is defined by the starkness of our partisan divide, where our differences are demonized and the sense of common purpose, common values, and community itself are strained to the very limits. We live in a broken world. The cups of the king have been shattered by the loss of this essential balance between freedom and responsibility. And yet, embedded in the essential meaning of Passover, our festival of freedom, we are taught to open the door for Elijah, to open our hearts to the stranger within our midst, to welcome all who are hungry to come and eat, and to remember that until all of us are free, none of us are truly free. The Passover Seder, which we experienced last night and tonight as well, is an expansive lesson on the compassion and loving kindness which we are to hold responsible, to share with one another. And the 13 attributes of God, which we recited just now, are not a mid-year makeup to cover our faults or failings since Yom Kippur, but rather as a reminder that we can be one, just as God is one, and that the same compassion we hope God might extend to us, we owe ourselves to extend to one another. That means welcoming the strangers who are clamoring at our gates. It means feeding the hungry in the spirit that all who are hungry should come and eat. And it means more than praying for a day when all will be free, but working for that day in tangible ways. May this be our blessing on this first day of Passover, that God's attributes of mercy may become our own. May we be the builders of a world of compassion and loving kindness for all of God's creatures. And may the world of our hands be blessed, and the work of our hands bring blessing. Amen. Please join me in the blessing after the reading of the Torah. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan lanu Torat emet, v'chayei olam nata b'tochenu. Baruch atah Adonai, noten haTorah.